Hello out there in YouTube land.
Welcome back.
Today we're going to talk about a very fun and unusual vampire film.
Night Flier.
If you haven't seen this one, it's based on a short story by Stephen King. And it is about a guy who works for like a tabloid newspaper. And he gets the assignment to go and investigate all these unusual deaths happening at these different airports around the country.
Enter the vampires.
Yes.
I think, personally, for me, if you wanted kind of the creepier version of a vampire, like not the suave, debonair, beautiful male or female vampire, you got the creature in this one. And the creature was really done well.
Yes, and bizarre.
Like the singular fangs.
Yes.
Like almost like they took a proboscis and a...
Yeah.
It's very different.
Made the vampire almost insect-like.
Yes.
And, you know, that gave rise to this definitely being an otherworldly creature, something that was never human.
Never human to begin with, had its own kind of realm that it came from, and didn't behave like you would see in what we would call the modern vampire.
Yeah. And, you know, and then you add to the fact that this took place in the 1980s. And yet, you know, you have this otherworldly being and stuff, but he learns how to fly a fucking plane.
Yeah. Not an easy task.
No. And so, you know, the idea you have to get is he's been around for a long time. He had to get education as things progress throughout the centuries in order to be able to have the knowledge in order to go take flying lessons or however he did this.
Which would be interesting.
Yes.
On how exactly he did that. But he had Renfields.
Yeah.
So, human servants.
And, you know, ideally there probably are some flight schools that do have, like, evening lessons and things like that. So you could kind of see that part of it. And then he probably used his powers to be able to get his license at night because, of course, no regular place
I
that
want to
does...
fly at night only, but...
Yeah, you know, they're not going to do the examinations and stuff at night, so he had to have used his powers to pull that one off. And, you know, he may not have actually even had his pilot's license. He might have just gone to school and learned how to fly. Because it wasn't like he was going into these places and, like, meeting people. He was just going in there and, like, killing people and then moving on about his, like, route.
Just, essentially, he was land and feed and move on.
Yeah.
He was still very much in that kind of more creature mentality rather than I'm going to rule the world mentality.
Exactly.
I really thought that in terms of the humans, they brought out some of the human kind of treachery and things like that that Stephen King is known for.
Yes. And I liked the fact that the female reporter that ends up getting added to the case, they really brought out her way of, you know, this skeezy tabloid reporter.
Yes.
Willing to even know how everything ended, but to bring it back into, well, this guy was a serial killer, so she could continue going after this vampire for more stories.
Yeah.
And so that made a nice parallel between the vampire that was a vampire and then the vampire that was a tabloid reporter.
Yeah. The vampire and the vampire.
Yes.
Because, well, let's face it, a lot of the 80s saw tabloid reporters. They would get in your business.
And it wasn't until the 2000s when the paparazzi aided in the death of Princess Diana that people really started to look into how insidious this whole thing is.
Yes, and how much of an invasion of personal space and personal privacy that, you know, that can occur with all of that.
And, you know, back specifically to the movie, it was really interesting to watch the progression of the male reporter as he tried to investigate and talk to other people. And the one scene that stands out to me is when he goes to try and talk to a lady that witnessed one of the vampire attacks and instead is met with this demon dog, essentially.
Yes.
And that demon dog, like, almost gets the reporter. It's really close.
And it's not the first time in a King movie that you kind of have that aspect with a dog.
No, it's not.
He really likes to not only creep you out in terms of something that is human-esque, but he kind of gets into that realm of the animals. Because we always think of animals as being innocent and great and sweet, and you don't get that with a demon dog.
No, and, you know, what's kind of cool about it is King himself is a huge animal lover.
He is.
And yet he likes to make the animals into something else also. So, in a way, he's kind of contorting the worlds he creates to where there are bad humans and animals as well as good humans and good animals, so that it's more realistic because there's this balance going on.
There is.
And so it's really cool how he does that. And I don't know if it's a conscious thing. I know for me being a writer myself, a lot of things I end up doing, I don't even think about that I'm doing it as I'm writing. So it'd be interesting to find out whether he makes that conscious choice or if it's just something that's innate to him that he includes in his stories.
Maybe it just evolves as the scene comes along, because
it's really cool.
Yeah, it's just, it adds that, kind of like that little extra in there. And it works for him. It works for the stories.
And, you know, the funny thing about this movie is that it was originally slated for a theatrical release. And then, like, if I remember the way it happened, the movie studio had gone under. So then the release was changed to a straight-to-TV release on, like, HBO or Showtime, one of those back in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I saw it. And I was just struck by how unique of not only, you know, the story itself is unique, but the film makes the vampire so different. Because in the story, the vampire is kind of a standard vampire. He doesn't have, like, this weird look or whatever. So the filmmakers made this conscious decision with the makeup design to make this vampire be something really out there.
Different, and not one that would fit, you know, when you think of the Transylvanian vampire or you think of any of the old lore. He doesn't fit that per se, but yet he does.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's really cool that they knew enough about vampires to be able to make his look be something totally unique.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is a really powerful thing. And the other thing I like about the film is toward the end of the movie, when the reporter is trying to escape the vampire, and the vampire is, you know, kind of evolving, and he's drank some of the reporter's blood and given him some of the blood back to let him see what his world is, and then he's able to see all the dead people come up almost like revenants.
Yes. And it's that's an interesting thought process.
Yes.
So it brings back kind of almost an insight into the mental state of the vampire, too.
And the vampire can literally balance between the worlds of the living and the dead.
Yes.
And so, you know, it's an awful lot to expect a movie to do something like that, but they pulled that off, which was really cool.
They pulled it off, and they pulled it off well.
Yeah. And then the fact that the revenants are actually able to attack the guy because he had drank some of the vampire's blood. So the vampire, in effect, made the reporter actually living in between the worlds of the living and the dead, so that he was able to kill all these revenants coming after him. But that's what led the people to think he was the serial killer, and was actually really tricky of the vampire to basically, in one fell swoop, pin all these murders right on this human.
Yep.
And of course, they don't have the scientific ability to test he has something weird in his blood.
Exactly. Not at that point.
No. So that was really clever. And, you know, if you haven't seen it, it's unfortunately not available on, like, DVD or anything. You might find an old VHS copy, but I found it on YouTube, so just Google the Night Flier and you'll be able to pull it up. The other thing I really, really like is it's also connected to another Stephen King story called Popsy. And Popsy is the story of this little kid that gets kidnapped by a man to introduce him into child trafficking. And he keeps saying that Popsy's going to come, and here Popsy's a vampire. And you can get an idea because the reason why the two stories are connected is the kid mentions, as he's talking about his father, that his father's a pilot.
Yep.
And so that wasn't the only story. And I'm hoping at some point somebody actually makes a full-on Popsy movie, because I think that would be fun.
Fun and applicable, and Stephen King really had a point of driving things home of what's going on in society at the time.
Yeah, and he's very, very good at looking at what a societal's problems are in a specific time period, and then adding a supernatural element and bringing that to life.
I mean, how many people after Cujo went and got their dogs vaccinated?
Exactly.
I mean, come on, that's pretty convincing.
Yeah.
That's just a minor thing.
But exactly. But, you know, it's effective.
It is. It's, you know, it's using your art and your standpoint to make people realize what's going on.
Yeah.
So that is our take on Night Flier. We actually enjoy this movie for its differences. And until next time.
Bye.